Hello everyone and welcome back to Knights of the Pageless Library. This is an audiobook discussion podcast. I am Ryan Knight and I will be your host for this episode. And today I am taking a look at Dies the Fire, written by S.M. Stirling and narrated by Todd McLaren. Before I get too far into it and you want to join the conversation, please feel free to email us. kotpl.pod@gmail.com is the easiest way to get a hold of us. You could find us on Twitter or X or whatever it's being called these days. You can find us on YouTube, Knights of the Pageless Library. I have one request that if you go over there and listen to anything we do, please hit like and subscribe or, whatever you're supposed to be doing these days with that stuff. You can also just do a quick Google search for us and you can find us pretty much anywhere on the internet. So with all that out of the way, let's get into this one. I listened to this book through Audible, and I'm sure plenty of people are getting tired of me saying that, so I also went ahead and did a little bit of research on a couple other places you could get audiobooks. Neither one of these are sponsored, so I'm not necessarily under any obligation to say anything about these, but I just want to point them out for somebody who might want different places to get audiobooks. You could go to LibriVox.org, and you can listen to over 18,000 free audiobooks there. All of the audiobooks recorded on LibriVox are in the public domain, so they are all non-copyrighted material as far as I understand. But all of the recordings are done by volunteers. So the quality, it might vary. It might not be the greatest, quality. But you have to take into the fact that it is all free and you can download tons of books for free. So that's an option for people as well. You could also go to audiobooks.com. They have, according to them, over 400,000 titles to choose from. And as far as I can tell, the kind of platform is very similar to Audible, in which you can purchase individual books. You could sign up for a monthly fee, in which you will get credits that you can then use once a month towards books. They also have a VIP option, in which you will get your credit, as well as a list of books that you can choose one of those for free as a VIP. So that is also an option as well. So hopefully that gives you a couple more options if you don't want to support the monopoly that Audible kind of has going on audiobooks. And I fully understand that, and I would support you as well if you wanted to support somebody else. This book I have, though, I've mentioned this before, that we use Audible simply for ease of use, and it's simply what we have been using for years now. That's generally why all of our books come from Audible. Okay, so Dies the Fire by S.M. Stirling. This book was published in 2004, and then the audiobook that I listened to was published in 2008 by Tantor. This book is also part of a series. It doesn't look like the one that I listened to is showing it, but this is a 3-part series. Okay, so the 3-part series is called A Novel of the Change. And then this part, I believe, it looks like these are all part of his greater thing that he calls the Emberverse. Just jumping back in here to say that this is part of a 13-book series, I believe, is what I finally found. And they vary. Some of them are called A Novel of the Change. Some of them are called the Emberverse series. I'm not really sure why he chose to do that, but wow, I lied again. 15 books. There's 15 books in these combined series. Now, if I remember right, after the first 3, the story kind of shifts to a later date, if I remember correctly. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the first 3 are very kind of tightly woven together, and then after that, I think we do a big time skip and we shift characters drastically. So just keep that in mind. It is part of a long series of books, if that's something you are looking for. They have also sort of recently, in 2020, started adapting these into dramatizations. I'm not 100% on how I feel about this, that it looks like they split the dramatization up. Let me see if I'm looking at this correctly. Okay, so you can either buy the 3 parts of the dramatization for book 1 individually, or it looks like you could get the entire book 1 dramatization as well, all in one, I'm assuming. But the pricing and things on the dramatization don't make a lot of sense to me, because the pricing on those is $34 for the total book or $18 a piece for the 3 parts. So you'd be paying, what is that? That's almost $60. So I don't really understand their thought process on that. The Dies the Fire book that I listened to is 22 hours long, and it comes in at a price of $30 if you chose to just purchase that book by itself. The dramatization, I should mention too, I started listening to the sample just to see what the difference is. It's obviously narrated by a total cast of people, which is interesting, but it also has a ton of music, sound effects, things like that to make it much more immersive, if you will. And it looks like they dramatized the first 3 books in this series, and maybe, who knows, maybe they're continuing on with the rest of them. I think I got a little sidetracked there. So S.M. Stirling is pretty well known for these types of books. This book is definitely a fantasy. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic. Let's see, what is the exact description it gives, since I am not very good at this? Sci-fi fantasy is basically what they're calling this book. And I think that that is kind of what S.M. Stirling is known for, is his sci-fi fantasy, mystery thrillers and suspense, as well as literature and fiction. So he's a very prolific fiction writer, and I chose to listen to this book, even though it's nearly 20 years old now, because this is a book that we had back on CD, and it was right around the time this book came out that we got this originally on CD, so I wanted to relive that experience by listening to it again. And I had largely I remembered some of the story, but I had largely kind of forgotten it. Upon re-listening to this, I had remembered a little bit about Todd McLaren's narration, and I remember thinking that it was good back then. Upon re-listening to it, I think that Todd McLaren does okay. He is a pretty prolific narrator on Audible. He has nearly 350 titles to his name, so he does a lot of books. I just think that he's okay. And the only reason I say that is that he does his best. We have a lot of different people of mixed genders and, ethnicities and things like that in this book. But I feel like his approach to some of these characters is borderline, I don't want to say it's borderline offensive, because that's not true. It just is kind of disconcerting. It sounds much more like, instead of multiple characters, it sounds much more like one guy trying to do voices. Now, that's not 100% fair to him, because, he is a good narrator. Obviously, he's a pretty prolific narrator. I don't want to take anything away from him, but upon re-listening to this, I don't think his performance was as good as I remember it being from back in the day, unfortunately. Alright, so we'll do a couple of the big questions here. Is this book easy to follow, even if maybe you're kind of doing something else, or you're daydreaming or something like that? Yes. In a way it is. And I only say that because we're going to shift perspectives quite a bit. But not only that, there are a couple points of perspective shifting, especially towards the end of this book, that I found myself confused by upon listening to it this time. And the only reason I say that is we're going to shift perspectives pretty rapidly. We're going to shift characters pretty rapidly. We're going to shift locations pretty rapidly. Even though the majority of the story is kind of told centered around realistically 2 main characters, we just jump locations a lot. And we jump the characters surrounding those 2 main characters, at least from the middle towards the end of the book, a lot. Upon listening to it this time, I was really trying to pay attention, and there are still a couple points in this book where I have no idea how and when certain characters get to where they're at. An issue I had with this, and I guess I should probably save this a little bit for right before I pass the spoilers in my recommendation, but kind of all ties together. An issue I had with this is that the pacing is a little bit strange. It's hard to tell if an hour has passed, a day, a month, 6 months. But then by the time the book is over, you realize only about 7 months has passed during this time. I found it very disconcerting this time, listening to it and kind of scrutinizing it a little bit, that is the only amount of time that has passed for the given circumstance, and then where everything ends up, in my opinion. And I only say, too, that it's hard to tell if a day has passed or an hour, because I'm rather familiar with some of these places that are talked about in this book. A lot of this book takes place in western Idaho, and then from eastern Oregon over towards like Portland, and then down the Willamette towards Corvallis Bend, that sort of central Oregon area. I have an issue with the amount of time that they are saying it takes to cover some of this ground. And honestly, there are parts where we jump from a part of Oregon, and then we're back up in western Idaho. And then next thing you know, the characters are back down in Oregon, which would be fine. But this book is centered around the idea of some sort of apocalyptic event that takes away pretty much all technology from people. At first they assume it's an EMP, which wipes out electronics, but that's not all that's wiped out. Gunpowder no longer works correctly. Fuels do not burn as hot anymore, so think gasoline and diesel, they do not combust like they used to. Even steam pressure is unable to reach pressures sufficient enough to run engines anymore. So pretty much all of our modern technology is taken away in this book, which is a great premise. But that leads to obviously traveling by, foot, bicycle, and horses is pretty much the main forms of transportation in this. And I just had a huge issue with, okay, they're going from Lewiston, Idaho, and now next thing we know, they're all the way down in Corvallis, Oregon. That's a considerable distance. The pacing of the book is strange in a sense that so much stuff might happen in one spot they're in. But then you're telling me that them traveling from Lewiston to Corvallis, nothing happens. Nothing of importance happens. Which just, I don't know, rubs me a little bit the wrong way, because I feel like those seem like they would be the times when the most would happen, is when they're trying to get from point A to point B. It's kind of a minor complaint. My overall recommendation of this story is that it is still extremely good. I love the concept of this book. I like a lot of things that this book does. I take a lot of issues with some of the stuff it does. I'll kind of talk about that once I pass the spoiler wall. I could probably recommend this to most people. It's a pretty solid listen. It has some very cool concepts that it approaches. And unfortunately, it almost feels like something like the catastrophe that happens in this book kind of needs to happen today. Full hard reset of everything across the board. Everybody starts from scratch again, because, and I don't want to get very political about this, I just think we've gotten, off on we've taken a very poor path in this existence. And without getting too preachy about that, I'll just let that one simmer, and you can let me know how you feel about that. So that's not really a hard recommendation one way or another. I just think that this is a good book. It has its issues, but this book is honestly kind of near and dear to me. Especially because, like I said, a lot of the areas discussed I am relatively familiar with. Just the story in general, I think the premise is very good. I would say overall, if you are into I say sci-fi too, and they put this as a sci-fi genre. This is very low sci-fi. Obviously, like I said, all technology is removed. Technically, everyone goes from, the current time, I think this takes place in 1998, to the medieval ages, essentially. So there's not, as far as I know in the story, there's not aliens and stuff like that. Maybe later on. At least in this book, there's not. But if you want like a pretty good story with a ton of books, maybe for you to dive into, I would definitely say this is worth picking up. So with all of that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and pass the spoiler wall. I'll talk about the story, talk about some of the stuff I like, some of the stuff I don't like. So if you don't want this spoiled for you at all, please pause the podcast now, go listen to the book, and then come back here and hear what I have to say. And then please join the conversation and email me and let me know what you have to say about it. Comment down below if you're listening on YouTube, and, like and subscribe, please. That would be very helpful, and I would really appreciate it. So the hook to this book is pretty solid. We open up with Michael Havel, and he is picking up his charges as a bush pilot out of Montana, and they are in Boise, and they are going to fly to Montana. He is taking the Larson family, Ken, Mary, Eric, Signe, and Astrid Larson to their ranch, I think it is, somewhere out in Montana. Something like that. Bunch of rich yuppie types. And as they're flying in Mike Havel's little plane, this is the first issue I had with the book upon re-listening. They switch their headsets over to like a, news, not a news channel. I don't know what it is. It's kind of, I'm assuming, when you're flying, you can also listen in on what other air traffic is talking about. And they're talking about a series of lights over Nantucket. And then all of a sudden they are all kind of blinded by this extremely harsh white light that doesn't necessarily flash from anywhere specifically, but it flashes like lightning in their eyes, essentially. The only reason I say I have an issue with this is technically, if they are on East Pacific and or Mountain Time, then I'm assuming the place where this information was supposedly coming from is several hours ahead. And I don't think that there would have been time, because of what this caused, I don't think there would be any time for the information to pass from the location that it supposedly started to where they are, when they're flying between Idaho and Montana. I guess them being several hours ahead doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. Obviously, it's taking place at the same time. But what I'm saying is I don't think that the speed that this incident traveled would have allowed any time for them to broadcast any information about it. If it were centered on the East Coast would have been knocked out by this, because as we will see, this incident also knocks out the electronics and the engines of the plane, so they are dead in the air, essentially. Minor detail, I know, and I think it was just setting up the idea that this thing is in multiple places already. So with that, their plane goes completely dead in the air, and they have to make an emergency landing, right? And they are in some pretty harsh wilderness to be able to do that. Mike Havel is going to be one of our two main characters, and the other one is going to be Juniper Mckenzie. At some point here, we jump over to Juniper Mckenzie, who is in Corvallis, Oregon. She is a Wiccan. She is the leader of a Wiccan group, if you will. She is singing in a little pub there in Corvallis. She does folk singing and stuff like that when the change happens there. And I'm just going to refer to it as the change. They don't start necessarily calling it that until a little bit later in the story, but I'm going to go ahead and start referring to it as that. Where she's at in Corvallis, it immediately turns into chaos because the change happens exactly the same way for them. They get this blinding flash of light in their eyes, essentially, even though they're indoors. Doesn't necessarily seem to radiate from one direction or another, like I said. In their eyes, it just blinds everyone for a few seconds. And again, powers out, everything goes dark. Shortly after this happens, though, in Corvallis, airplanes just start falling out of the sky, right? Passenger planes just start crashing to the ground. This immediately starts setting the city on fire. So now these fires are raging out of control, and there's absolute pandemonium and chaos. And of course, as people are to do, there are people who immediately see this as an opportunity to start raiding, stealing things, robbing stores. And one of the first hints we get that a lot of stuff has changed is that Juniper and one of her friends witnesses this cop try to shoot this group of, I think there's 3 of these kind of bandits, and his gun just sort of makes like a sound, and the bullet kind of just falls, 10 feet away from his gun. Obviously not traveling at the speed that a bullet should travel. He tries again, it does the same thing. So these looters immediately see an opportunity that now they have the advantage because all they have is, handheld weapons, knives, hatchets, crowbars, anything like that is now a huge advantage. Juniper and her friend, I'm trying to remember his name, Dennis, I believe, along with her deaf daughter, Eilear, I should mention because she's also a big part of this story. They end up saving this police officer from these group of bandits, and one of them, he'll come back later in the story, but it's not that big of a deal. I'll talk about it here in a little bit. And I cannot remember the exact timing. I think we jump back up to Mike Havel. This is what I meant too when I said we're going to jump perspectives quite a bit. Now, most of the story is centered just around Juniper and Mike Havel, and kind of what their two groups go through during this incident. The perspective shifts are going to happen a decent amount. Potentially, if you were reading this yourself, these obviously would be easy distinguishing points. With the audio version, sometimes where maybe you're reading a physical book, it might have a paragraph, and then maybe it just has a big line break, and then a new paragraph starts to give the reader a sense that, okay, we're shifting points here. It doesn't come across very well if those are in the book. It does not come across well in audio form, because the narrator, by no fault of their own, will end one paragraph and then obviously immediately start the next paragraph. They're not going to pause for 5 seconds to let you know that there was a passage of time here. Again, minor complaint, just something that I noticed while I was listening to it this time. At some point early in the story, too, we jump over to, oh man, what's his name? Lord Protector, Arminger. So basically we jump over to the middle of Portland, and the character Eddie Lou, who had attacked the Mckenzies in Corvallis, or who they had chased off, essentially, is meeting with... No, I'm getting that wrong. It's not Eddie Lou at this point. That's later, I believe. So, scratch that. But either way, we jump up to Portland, and we get a little bit of a perspective of what's going on here. So this guy, Arminger, basically has been preparing for this moment for the power to go out for his entire life. He studied this stuff back in college, however long ago, medieval times. So what he does, as an example, is he gets a group of, I believe they're like, I don't even remember if they're criminals. There's a little bit of like racist undertones here, but he gets a group of people of mixed backgrounds, races, and things like that to try to attack him. Now, he is in, I believe, full armor. He has a shield and like a longsword, and he lets them pick any weapons they want. Baseball bats, machetes, axe, whatever. He gives them their choice. And as a demonstration, he gets all of these gang leaders around Portland who survived the initial change to come to where he is kind of set up shop and witness him fighting, I believe it's 5 men at one time, 4 or 5 men at one time, showing them he kills all of these guys relatively easily. And he basically makes a show of it, saying, this is the future. You know, we gotta take things from the past to go forward now. Things like armor and forged weapons and shields and the abilities to use them are going to be what the winners are using. That little tiny snippet is going to be important because Arminger, even though he doesn't get a lot of attention in this book, we get a couple more snippets of him throughout the book. We're going to hear a lot about him. This Lord Protector, I think is what he goes under the name of, or the Protector. And the Portland Protective Association is his group that he starts. I can't stand the name, and I for sure thought that somebody who loved medieval stuff would have come up with a cooler name than that. But anyways, again, minor detail. So we jump back over to Mike Havel with his group of people after their plane crash. They are out in the wilderness. Another minor complaint I have is that Mike Havel has potentially the thickest plot armor of any character I've ever seen in my life. He also can do no wrong. He's a very hard character to relate with. I actually think that Juniper Mckenzie is a much more relatable character because she seems much more like a normal person, aside from the fact that she is a quote-unquote witch in her Wiccan coven group. She's a much more relatable character, and I'll talk about that a little bit more once we shift back to her perspective. Mike Havel, he was a Marine, and he also just seems to have done everything and seen everything and knows how to do everything first try. No matter what he does, he can do it, and he can always do it well. Okay, I mean, obviously he's the main character. We need a strong main character, but he's just a couple notches over the top, in my opinion, but that's my opinion. So once they crash, he kind of has a general idea of where they were when they crashed, and he knows that there's a forestry lodge somewhere nearby that he thinks if they can get to, maybe, they can radio for help, something like that. At this point, they have no idea that this is kind of a worldwide thing that happened. All they know is that all of their electronic equipment quit working. The only things I think that still function are like their mechanically wound clocks that like one person has. He's in a bit of a bind here because Mary Larson, I believe, broke her leg in the crash. It's kind of hard going, obviously, getting her out. So they end up getting to this cabin, and then they decide that Mike and Eric, being the youngest and the most fit people, will quickly try to make their way out to the nearest highway and, try to get some help and get Mary out of there. They find that the cabin has some supplies, which is great, but also they figure out that the cabin, the radio, I think, is dead, and nothing works in the cabin either. So they're kind of just stuck there. So they leave Signe, Astrid, Mary, and Ken there. They make their way out to the highway, and then at some point I think we jump back perspectives to Juniper, but I'll just continue on here what I can remember that happens with them. Eric and Mike. Eric and Signe are twins, but Signe is described as being a very attractive young woman, and I think they're 18 or 19, I believe. And Mike is 28. Eric doesn't like the way that Mike looks at his sister, so they get into a little bit of a scuffle here, a little bit of a tussle. Mike's telling Eric, go ahead and attack me, if you have some aggression, you need to get out, go ahead. And he bests him at every turn, And it's kind of just showing why Eric eventually kind of falls in line with him to accept Mike as the new leader of their group. Once they get out to the highway, though, the first thing they run into is it's always extremes. It's never just like they run across some people who are like, hey, what's going on? No, it's 3 guys who have captured Will Hutton, I believe is his name, his wife, Angelica, and their daughter. And Will Hutton is a black man, and Angelica is of Hispanic descent, and then obviously their daughter. And of course, the 3 men who captured them are like Aryan skinheads, and they think that this is the end times. They're also very like radically religious, thinking that God did this in order to allow their kind, quote unquote, the Aryans, to rise. So again, here we go with just another drastic. This book, at least it seems like from Michael Havel's perspective, it's always just got to be the worst shit that happens in front of him. Eric and Mike proceed to free Will Hutton. Well, kind of. Basically what happens in this little bit of a scuffle is that they best these 3 men, but Will Hutton, even though I think he's like strapped to his horse, he ends up taking his horse off down the trail that Mike and Eric came out of. So they rescue Angelica and their daughter and tell them to stay safe, somewhere safe. And the 3 men had gone after Will. Just FYI, there is some strong words here used that may offend some listeners, so just be aware of that. Now, an issue I have with this is that I don't know how long it took Mike and Eric to walk out to the highway. It seemed like it was a pretty far distance. For some reason, the bandits and Will Hutton go straight down the same path all the way back to the cabin. They go right back to the cabin. So they end up leading. Will, I guess, unknowingly leads these 3 piece of shits back to the cabin. Now, I don't know if I completely missed something. I could have sworn that Will was on a horse, kidnapped, and the 3 men were also on horseback. But later on it said that they had one was on horseback and 2 were on bicycles, or 1 was on bicycle. Anyways. Either way, they go back to the cabin. So now Eric and Mike have to go back to the cabin. They have to follow him. This is the first kind of scuffle we have in the book, the real scuffle. They end up going into the cabin. One of these dudes is outside. Mike has to kill him. They end up doing this in the dark, Before Mike and Eric can get there, they end up killing the guy outside. They go in, and of course, again, it's just like the worst shit possible. The one dude is trying to, like, Signy is on her knees, and he's obviously trying to force her to do some unspeakable acts. Astrid comes out of one of the rooms completely naked, because one of the other guys killed their mother, Mary, and attempted to rape her. It's just like the worst shit possible. They end up killing these 3 guys, just because I don't know where to come back and put this in. I should mention that Mike Havel has like a war cry that he always does, and the narrator consistently says it differently most of the time. The most consistent way he says it is kotpl, and Mike explains in the book what that means, but he says it sometimes kotpl, kotpl. I'm just saying, it gets mixed up a lot, and it bugs me. But again, let's add that to the minor details. And again, this is where I say I think the plot armor comes in a tad strong. I should mention here that Astrid is extremely into like Lord of the Rings and things like that. So a lot of stuff going forward here, she mentions, she ties it to Lord of the Rings for herself. She's also an incredibly skilled marksman with a bow. So that skill comes in very handy here. I'm going to jump back to Juniper now. Juniper ends up with her friend, I'm going to keep forgetting his name, Dennis. They make the decision to go to Juniper's property that was left to her from her uncle or something like that. And it's up in the mountains around Corvallis, I believe. It's somewhere out there, Corvallis Valley area. But the way it's described is it's sort of in the mountain. She also has like 2 horses and a big horse-drawn wagon, because apparently she used it for like Ren fairs and things like that. It was supposed to just be decorative, but now it's obviously extremely useful because now it's a great form of transportation. So they end up going to Juniper's cabin, and their goal is basically to go up there. It's a large plot of very fertile land because it's in the Willamette Valley, kind of establish a home for their coven. Juniper's boyfriend, I think he is, dies in one of the flights that crashed in Corvallis early on, so she's kind of upset about that. But we'll find out later on that Juniper is kind of a free spirit when it comes to that stuff. She had Eilir when she was like 16. She was very young when she had Eilir. And Eilir, I believe in this, is around 14 to 16. She's somewhere in that age now. Juniper being 29, 30, somewhere in there. These 2 groups, the Mckenzies, what's going to be known as Mike Havel's group, the Bear Killers. The difference is that I think the Mckenzie's story is much more down to earth. At least down to even this changed Earth. The only problems I end up having with their side of the story is there's a lot of Ex Machina stuff on their side as well as on Mike's side. For example, they end up finding some guy that's out in the woods, Sam Elward, who was hunting near Juniper's property when the change happened. So he didn't even know the change had happened, but he had fallen into a ravine and he was stuck there for several days after the change happened. They rescue him, and come to find out he was a former British SAS soldier. He is a goddamn like sniper with a bow, and he can make bows himself from basically, he like MacGyvers them from scratch. It's a little too on the nose. I feel like maybe if you told me more time had passed, they'd be coming across these specialized people, because I think these specialized people would survive an incident like this much more likely. The only things they end up running into are specialists in their field, bandits, looters, and the Protector's men, and freaking eaters, cannibals. It's like one extreme or the other, and I just, again, nitpick, but it's there. The Mckenzies focus much more on setting up their farmland. They luck out, and on their way up to her property, they come across her neighbor's place that they were going to cut through. These 2 people died pretty quickly because I think they were diabetics, so obviously their insulin could not be refrigerated anymore, and they couldn't use it anymore, and this has been a week or so once they go through there. So they get a bunch of supplies. These folks were also Mormon, so they stored a lot of canned goods, foods and stuff in there, root cellars, things like that, and they had a lot of animals. So again, off to a great start here in the most dire situation ever. Then let's jump back over to Mike Havel. Will Hutton, the guy that they saved, again, a super specialist. He's a horse guy. He is a wrangler, he's done rodeo stuff, he's done it all. He knows everything that there is to know about horses. So, perfect for this situation. So now they have his horses, they have Mike and his little group, and they move on, and I believe they're trying to get to Lewiston. Now, Ken Larson was an engineer, so quickly him and Will Hutton kind of bond because they also are both very handy dudes. I'm going to keep nitpicking this until I pick it apart, unfortunately. They basically rig up like a trailer to use to pull with the horses. I picture them just using a regular kind of two axle flatbed trailer or something like that. They rig it up to pull with horses. Great. Smart. Genius. The problem I have is when they start talking about cutting it apart and re-drilling holes. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to drill through steel with a normal drill. Not very easy. So if you try to tell me that they drilled these holes by hand through steel with a drill bit and like a hand drill, I'm going to tell you that would have taken months to accomplish. I'm not saying they couldn't do it, but they basically make it sound like they accomplished this in a day. I have a slight problem with that. They also say that a lot of the cutting and then the fabricating they end up doing with weapons is done with oxygen and acetylene. Now, if oxygen and acetylene still burn plenty hot enough to make forges with and cut steel with, then the book is kind of not following its own rules, because then you could technically use oxygen and acetylene for a lot more things, in my opinion. Oxygen and acetylene mixed become an explosive. They become all kinds of weapons as well. So again, it's just blurring the lines between its own rules and the real world rules. They end up making their way to the nearest town, which I believe is somewhere near Lewiston, Idaho. Their kind of ultimate goal here is to go to the Larson's ranch, Larsdalen, and settle down there in the long run. Along the way, what they end up doing is they kind of stop in these little towns and they pick up more and more people. And essentially they become kind of a band of traveling mercenaries. And what they end up doing is they really kind of focus on picking up people who have talents. One of the first ladies that joins them she is a veterinarian, but lo and behold, she's a jack of all trades. She did fencing and Ren Fair type of reenactments and things like that, so all of this stuff comes very naturally to her. One of the few characters that stands out in all of this is they bring on this guy named Billy Waters, and the only reason they bring him on is because he worked at a bow making company for a few years before the change and says he can make bows still. So this becomes a good asset for them. Now he can make some bows, they can use those for trading, things like that. The only reason Waters stands out to me is because Waters is actually a very believable character in this. Again, it's much more enjoyable when there are characters you can kind of see as being a real life person versus some of the people they find who it's like they're the expert at this and they know how to do this and they know everything about this. And it's like, how often do you meet people like that? Yeah, you might meet people who know a lot of things about a lot of stuff, but very rarely do you meet someone who is an expert in most things they've ever tried. Waters to me stands out because at one point in the book, the Bear Killers, and I'll go ahead and explain why they become the Bear Killers, is because at some point Astrid, and I think I might have been saying Signe before, Astrid, the younger Larson girl, who's good with the bow. She's also really good at shooting from horseback. She shoots a bear. Bear charges into their camp and tries to attack them. It ends up clawing Mike Havel's face, but Mike ends up killing it by stabbing it with a spear. That's why they become known as the Bear Killers, because then they put this bear's head on Mike's helmet, and that's their new sigil, basically. So back to Billy Waters, why I think he stands out is because he's also an alcoholic, or at least a drunk, before the change. So now he has this vice that he still has to fulfill, after the change. Alcohol now being an extremely rare kind of delicacy. At least they say that, but in reality, nothing has changed with making alcohol. As long as you can still heat water and find yeast and anything with sugar in it, you can pretty much make alcohol. Waters ends up betraying the group a little bit later on because Mike treats him like shit because he thinks that and Billy is rightfully so kind of a piece of shit. He hits his wife, he hits his kids. He's kind of a piece of shit. And he ends up betraying the group. But to me, that's one of the most believable characters in the entire story, because it seems like the only characters they focus on are these incredibly talented and useful people. But it's like, the world is not filled with those people. And even after the change, yeah, there would be a ton of people who died. But there would still be this is only a couple weeks after the change. There would be a lot of those kind of people like Billy Waters still roaming around trying to find their way in life. So anyway, just something I focused on. The Bear Killers earn some reputation because they end up taking out a group of, I think they're bandits. There's a group of bandits kind of harassing Lewiston. They end up killing these guys. They end up taking out a group of eaters, cannibals, which is fine. I think that that's a realistic thing that probably would happen. But again, we're talking like 2 or 3 weeks after the change. People are already eating each other. It's like, I don't know if I would have written it that quickly into the story, but here we are. The two groups end up meeting because the Mckenzies end up going towards, I believe it's around Bend, somewhere up there. And then, again, I don't know how Havel's group so quickly travels down there. Havel goes with a couple people. He ends up meeting with the Protector. And the Protector basically tells him that he's offering certain parts of land near the Willamette Valley for leaders. Basically, he's turning this into like a feudal system where he is essentially the king, and he's going to break his kingdom up into fiefs for his knights. His knights will then establish their own areas, and they will run them, providing him, the Lord Protector, with men, food, and taxes, essentially. But in return, they get the support of him and the Portland Protective Association. Havel is like, okay, this dude's crazy. He has no idea what he's talking about. But the one thing that the Protector has on his side is that they, very quickly in Portland, he has all of his men armed and armored very well. They start mass-producing crossbows, spears, pikes, halberds, swords, shields, armor. He has a huge jump on most everybody. Now, the other two groups start producing the same stuff. Chainmail, leather jerkins and armor, helmets, things like that. Realistically, what Arminger has going on is he has the numbers, right? He started in Portland, he got a ton of people in Portland behind him, and he also really quickly established a hierarchy of him at the top, his lackeys underneath him, and then essentially slaves below that to do all of the hard work. They notice along the Columbia River that Arminger quickly set up blockades along I-84, He's using the rail system still by getting rid of the locomotives and using teams of horses to pull rail cars back and forth, which is an extremely good idea because you can move a lot of weight with very little resistance when it's metal on metal rail, to be honest. So with hand-operated brakes, this is a fully feasible thing that would be done. Another thing that I kind of take issue with is once they get in these certain areas, it's either Arminger's men or it's no one. And it's just kind of strange. Juniper ends up meeting with Mike anyways, somewhere as Mike travels down the Willamette, somewhere down there towards, I think that's where Larsdalen might be. I honestly can't remember, because at some point they talk about Montana, then they talk about some stuff in Idaho, then they talk about Larsdalen, which maybe is in the Willamette Valley. He meets up with Juniper because he saves her from a group of eaters when they were out scouting to see kind of how some stuff was going on and where Arminger's men had moved south towards where they live. They meet, they really like each other right away, and he saved her life. And they bone twice, to be exact. And then they go their separate ways, right? Mike goes back to his place, Juniper goes back to hers, and Mike definitely like hitting on Signy a lot before he had left and hooks up with Juniper, so that kind of creates some drama there. Find out very quickly though that Juniper is pregnant from this. Go figure. The kind of culmination of the story is that the Mckenzies are pushing back against Arminger's men from the south, and then that the Bear Killers are kind of moving from east to west, pushing back against his men as well. They end up helping a group around the Bend area. This Sheriff Woburn and his guys are being harassed by one of Arminger's men, Duke Ironrod, who has taken up in, I believe it's in a church or something like that. So they have to come up with a way of getting into this church, and it's like, obviously it's extremely well fortified. It's a well-built church, and it even had an outer bailey with walls and towers and things like that. So he's in an extremely well fortified position. The Bear Killers come up with the idea. Okay, that's what it is. So Ironrod is held up in the church. They end up deciding, in order to get rid of Ironrod, they will attack one of his raiding parties as it goes out. They successfully do this, but this is when I was talking about that Billy Waters betrays them and turns them into Duke Ironrod. And so Ironrod and his men attack the Bear Killer camp while they are attacking his raiding party. And Ironrod himself is there. Super badass, like huge dude. And he ends up jacking up a lot of people. Ken Larson ends up losing his hand as well as one of his eyes. Havel ends up returning just in time, and I shit you not, there is a line when Duke Ironrod attacks Havel. Havel successfully defends against it and then says something to the effect of, "My turn," and kills him. And it's kind of lame. Like, if I'm being honest, it's very unfitting. Again, though, Havel's character has the thickest plot armor in potentially any story I have ever heard, unfortunately. The Mckenzie party ends up attacking from the south and pushing back against Ironrod's men, or not Ironrod, excuse me. Once they remove Ironrod, the next thing is that the Protectorate has set up a castle on Highway 20, moving from, I believe, north to south. So the Mckenzies push back against that from the south, and then they team up with the Bear Killers. Sam Elward ends up going to join the Bear Killers to raid this castle. Again, I don't know when Sam gets there. I don't know when he leaves. It's very strange. He kind of like appears with the Bear Killers, helps them, and then he just appears back with the Mckenzies for their couple of raids and things they do. It's kind of strange. This is what I was talking about. They end up getting in the castle by paragliding into the castle from the top. I believe it's like Mike, Signy, Sam Elward, Eric. Yeah, it might only be the four of them. And then they like... The only reason they're able to accomplish this too is they had some gal from inside the castle giving them information on the inner workings of the castle. They end up successfully raiding the castle, like burning the parts of it to the ground, things like that. They win, right? Mike goes back, gets engaged to Signy, or marries her, I believe. I don't remember which one it is. And then at the end of the book, Juniper has her baby, and she names it Rudy. That's pretty much the end. And again, a lot of good premises here. I skipped a lot of stuff. They kill a lot of cannibals. but when you take all of this into consideration, start to finish, from change to the end of the book, it's been about 9 months, give or take. Less than a year. I have a hard time believing that so many places would be so well organized within a year. I believe it would have taken minimum of 1 year to have certain things like the Portland Protective Association in place and established. I know the idea is that Arminger is moving fast and he's working extremely hard to gain a foothold. That's all well and good, and I believe he would have succeeded in that within the greater Portland metro area. It's also strange to me that they say that they, built castles and things like that. Makes a lot of sense when it's out on like a highway, an isolated highway where they need to build a building to block off the highway. But there are several parts where they go into cities and they're like, oh, and we go and meet in this building that they built. But it's like, what? There's tons of buildings that are still there. Steel buildings that are still there that could have easily just been reinforced to make them impenetrable, essentially, by siege. So that stuff bothers me a little bit. Again, these are minor complaints. And I know that's mostly what this review has been filled with, but don't let that take away from the overall idea of the story. I think that's where the story really shines. And I do really like the Clan Mckenzie stuff is actually some of my favorite stuff. Mike Havel is just too superhero for me, and I don't really like superhero stories. I don't like when a character has such impenetrable plot armor that they can do no wrong, like Mike Havel does. We get a lot more stuff with Juniper that she is just a normal person who happened to fall into this leadership role. Because she was already the leader of this group of witches, her coven, she just naturally kind of falls into this group leadership role where these other people decide that she is the leader of it, and they start calling her Lady Mckenzie and things like that. Or Lady Juniper, excuse me. That's much more believable. I'm not saying that Havel's story is not believable at all. I just feel like there would be far less people willing to kind of fall into a military-style way of running things that he runs into. Now, if you told me he ran into a group of Marines right after this, and he quickly rounds, 20 of them up and gets them to follow orders, sure, I'll believe that all day. I just don't know how comfortable I am with the idea that all these normal people were perfectly willing to fall into his military style of leadership within such a short amount of time. Now, yeah, you tell me it's 6 months down the road and these people are all starving and that's their only option for survival. Absolutely, I'll believe that. But when you tell me it's been like 3 weeks since the change, I don't know. It just is a little unbelievable to me. I like more of the characters that surround Juniper Mckenzie. They're just more believable as people. They have faults, they have flaws, they have weaknesses. I just appreciate that a lot more than a lot of the people that surround Havel, and they're all just pretty much invincible. Now, I think at one point Signy gets her nose cut during one of the final fights. They're too superhero for me. And that's my opinion. Maybe you're into that stuff. Maybe you like a decent superhero story without the name of a superhero, and maybe this is what you're looking for in that case. But again, these are just my opinions, and that's how I feel about it. If you want to let me know how you feel about it, please feel free to comment down below or send me an email, kotpl.pod@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. Thank you everybody for listening, especially if you made it to this point. This is a long one. I don't ever mean for it to be, but I can tend to ramble. So again, thank you guys so much, and I hope to catch you in the next one.